Good afternoon and welcome to our event today, After the Polls Close, Countering Election Disinformation on Social Media. Before we get to our discussion and introduce our panelists, just a couple of housekeeping items. We'll be taking your questions at the end of the program. Please feel free to submit them using the questions tab on your screen or on Twitter using the hashtag #AfterThePollsClose. And in conjunction with this event, the CAP Technology Policy Team has published a new report on this subject. We encourage you to read. It's entitled Results Not Found, Addressing Social Media's Threat to Democratic Legitimacy and Public Safety After Election Day. And we hope you will all take a look at that, and we'll be discussing it today. Before we get started, I just wanted to say a few words. Election day is fast approaching, but the 2020 election is already well underway. People are voting in record numbers. Today, the latest numbers from the University of Florida's U.S. Election Project are showing that more than 52 million people have already voted, a record number. And, I think as we talk about social media and the impact it has on the election or can have on the post-election period, much of the focus has really been on the pre-election period, from where we are now with early voting through election day. And there's been a lot less thought given to the post-election period, which may be longer than ever due to the historic turnout and the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, we like to think about it at CAP as something that runs from the moment the polls close all the way through the peaceful transition of power on the presidential level in January 20th, 2021. So as I mentioned today, we're out with a new report about the post-election period and the threats we see possible to democratic legitimacy and the potential for violence and public safety in this moment. When we started writing this report a few weeks ago, there were very few policies from platforms around this election and around this post-election period. And even while we were writing it over the last few weeks, we were lucky enough to start to see some real developments from the platforms on this. But we think that the concerns are real, and some of the developments don't go far enough in preparing what could be a very problematic time. So we think it's important to have this discussion now as a forward-looking event where we hope that it won't be necessary, but we think it's important to talk about it and prepare for it so that we know what is coming, not just on November 3rd, but in the days, weeks, and months after. The timing of this is very good. Today, Accountable Tech, the organization, released new polling that showed that more than 8 in 10 voters are concerned about people using social media to incite violence after the election, 85%, and to cast doubt on the actual election results, 81%. We think it's critical for social media platforms to prepare for this period with algorithm changes, new policies, and increased enforcement. We need multiple layers to help us get through what could be a truly unprecedented time. At its core, I think it really comes down to the fact that once the polls close, votes can no longer be cast. Voters can no longer be directly influenced, and the platforms need to move to a more aggressive posture to really ensure public safety and democratic legitimacy. So today we have an all-star panel joining us to discuss how social media platforms should be preparing for both the election and, critically, the post-election period. So first off, we have Ifeoma Ozoma, who is the founder and principal of Earthseed, a consulting firm, and is a tech policy expert with experience leading global partnerships, public policy content safety development, and policymaker engagement at both Facebook, Pinterest, and Google. She's also on the first draft board of directors. Kip Wainscott is a senior advisor at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center, where he directs initiatives for the Global Digital Policy Incubator, advancing digital policies that reinforce democratic values and human rights. He is also a senior advisor to the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, where he develops programs around the impact of digital policies and practices. Kip has also served in the Obama White House as Senior Director of Cabinet Affairs and Senior Advisor to the Domestic Policy Council, and is an election lawyer. And finally, Melissa Ryan writes Control, Alt-Right, Delete, a weekly newsletter focused on disinformation and the alt-right. She is the CEO and chief strategist of Card Strategies, a consulting firm that helps organizations mitigate the threats posed by disinformation, extremism, and online toxicity. Previously, Melissa spent a decade leading digital campaigns for nonprofits and political races. Thank you all for being here. Before we get started onto the meat of the post-election period, I do want to take a moment to talk about the moment we're in, which is the actual election that is going on. I mentioned more than 52 million people have already voted. There is a global pandemic going on. And so this may change the election and the timeline for election results as we have traditionally experienced it. So before we switch entirely to the tech side, I do want to call on Kip's previous experience as an election lawyer to maybe talk a little bit about how we should be thinking about the election this year, about how the election results might come in and be counted, and whether that's on a longer timeline, because I think that's really important for us to have that context and expectation before we go into our discussion of the post-election. So Kip, do you want to maybe share a little bit?
Sure, definitely, Adam. Let me first just start by saying how grateful I am to be a part of this discussion, particularly alongside such exceptional co-panelists whose work I really admire. So major thanks to Cap and to you, Adam, for pulling this together. To your question, there are a lot of factors that are contributing to the prospect of a post-election atmosphere that's, potentially more protracted and just more vulnerable to some of the risks that we're going to be talking about today. And while I think all of these factors tend to kind of reinforce each other, I think at a high level, you can group them into three categories. The first are just the inherent complexities of our system and post-election processes. The second category includes the potential for delayed results, particularly in connection with the pandemic. And then the third are what you might think of as societal or democratic vulnerabilities right now. And so, just to kind of briefly take these sort of one at a time, first, even in ordinary times, our post-election processes are complicated. Our electoral system is highly decentralized. It's highly federated, administrated under a variable collection of state laws. And after the polls close, every state undertakes some process to officially count the votes and certify results. But those processes can look pretty different state by state. They have different timelines, different counting rules, observation rules. There are different deadlines for accepting mail-in ballots after Election Day. There are even different features like curing ballots, for example. In about 20 states, voters have an opportunity after the polls close to cure a deficiency or verify their identity to ensure their vote is included in the count. And if you happen to live in one of the places where that's not permitted, it might seem strange to you if you're learning about it on the news or in a Facebook post in the context of a hotly contested, post-election counting period. There are also different rules about when a recount can happen or when it must happen in certain states. And so it's not a tidy picture, for a close election, even in normal times. Now, let's, add on to that, this second category, the pandemic and the prospect for delays. The pandemic will impact counting processes in a few ways, potentially. There might be in-person staffing limitations during the count, for public health safety. We've already seen the pandemic inspire an enormous spike in mail-in ballots, as you noted, and those can take longer to count. And it's also coinciding with a moment in which our postal service is kind of in duress. It's under-resourced, it's in high demand. And that may contribute to slower delivery times and delays in results and in the reporting of results can lead to these sort of information voids, which create the kind of fertile conditions where disinformation and conspiracy theories and sensational speculation really tend to thrive. And so there's that. And then finally, this sort of third category, which is that the risks are really kind of compounded by the fact that this is a relatively delicate moment for our democracy. Over time, we've seen a steady erosion of norms that contribute to democratic stability. We've seen the emergence of the sorts of digital risks that we're going to be talking about today. And we've also seen declining trust and confidence in our democracy itself. Something like 30% of millennials, allegedly my generation, only 30% indicated in a study that they believe living in a democracy is important. And a quarter think that free elections are unimportant. So essentially, we're looking at a trust deficit. And taken together, it's like these nesting dolls of complexity, risk, vulnerability. And I think what all of this means is that we have to continue calling attention to these dynamics, both so the sort of powerful stewards of our information environment, like traditional media and digital tech platforms, can better understand the risks, anticipate them, and hopefully prepare to navigate the moment responsibly. But also so we're normalizing this picture for the wider public, that it may be messy, it may look a little bit different in different places, and it may take longer than usual, but that is not suggestive that anything nefarious is afoot or that anything has gone wrong. It's just what the process might require.
Thanks, Kip. I think that's super important context. And I think that we all need to keep that in mind on November 3rd when we try and turn our TVs and expect something that things are just a little bit different now because of the pandemic and other issues, and that doesn't mean there's anything wrong. And so, I think before we fully turn to the post-election period, there is one theme in our report and in a lot of the work I know many of you have done that runs both through the pre and post-election period. And I think that's concerns about violence, concerns about public safety, particularly around when it comes to voting and the results. And so I want to touch on that for a moment, because I think that's a through line through all of this. And so, I think turning to that subject is, I think, really critical. Ifeoma, like me, you've worked at major social media platforms, and you've been charged with thinking through content policy and enforcement as it relates to safety and violence prevention, health, and other things. And what are your concerns around violence, both before and after the election? What are you seeing that makes you feel okay about it, or what are you worried about? And how do you think the platforms are prepared to handle this really uncertain time?
Well, my concern is mainly that our approach, or the platform approach to misinformation, has been primarily reactive. And in a time when, particularly before and on election day and immediately following election day, where responses have to be timely, there needs to be more of a proactive effort from the platforms to address not only actual violence that may take place, but what we're seeing more is rumors of violence. I was listening to KQED this morning, and there was a discussion about how there are very few, if any, credible threats that the Secretary of State or the governor's office have received for polling locations in the state of California. But what we're seeing on many different platforms are rumors of violence. And what that does is it lends to voter suppression and depression, particularly in Black and brown communities. And my concern is that platforms don't have a plan in place for what they're going to do on election day for folks who are not part of the 52 million who have already cast their ballots, but are planning on going and may see a rumor on Twitch, on Twitter, on Facebook, wherever, and that may discourage them from going and placing their ballot. And so there needs to be a plan in place to not only limit distribution of potential rumors, but then also address and provide information to potential voters about the ways that they can call their secretaries of state, they can call other local authorities if they are seeing things, and not just share a video on Facebook that may not actually have even taken place on election day, or may blow out of proportion what someone is seeing. I think that, though, has to be balanced, and these are the conversations that I had while I was working at the platforms that I worked at. That has to be balanced with the ability for people on the ground, if they are witnessing violence, to be able to share that. And so I don't think that shutting down all distribution of any conversations around election day violence is the appropriate decision, but the platforms need to take a more proactive approach to sharing information with voters. And many of them have that, because almost every platform that I'm aware of, at least, is in contact with the secretaries of state for each state.
I think that's a really important point. And I think one of the things we make in our report and in our previous report around COVID and misinformation is we have to take into account a timeliness element as well. And so in the period where people can vote, if that can do disproportionate harm, it merits being a little more aggressive on the distribution side to make sure that you can appropriately balance that. But I think there are other fears, I think, in this period as well. And Melissa, I want to turn to you, given your expertise and really what you've been documenting over the last few months, which is in this kind of lead up to the election, the online rumors, the online organizing, the real world violence we've seen that's been organized online, the kind of fears that there may be mobilization if there's an election outcome that people don't agree with. What are you seeing in the pre and post election period, and what are you worried about? And what do you think platforms are doing or could be doing more of?
I mean, platforms have been failing on curbing violence generally. And I think when you see the Kenosha shooting is such a recent example of that, a group that had been reported nearly 500 times to Facebook, largely by people in the community, and got no response, and an event that had a pretty clear call to violence that wasn't taken down, and we know the result. I think it's really when we think about how this might play out, I think a great example to look to are the Reopen protests that we saw during the pandemic. And they were nationally resourced. They popped up seemingly overnight. All of a sudden there were hundreds of Facebook groups. I mean, I have screenshots where you would search Reopen and 200 groups would come up. The language was the same, but the events were localized. And it gave local militia groups and other local groups a way in to sort of turn these protests, create a more violent element to these protests already. So I think it's perfect. It's possible that if there is a widespread call for violence or civil unrest, that you might see something that mirrors what we saw in the Reopen groups.
That's troubling, but also something that's important to pay attention to, and that's obviously why we've seen, we think, increased action against certain groups that were organizing ahead of time that have been particularly problematic in the conspiracy theory space and others. I want to pivot now a little bit because we do think this through line runs both pre and post election to the post election period. And I do want to highlight, as I mentioned at the beginning, when we started writing our report a few weeks ago, there were almost no policies in place for this. Since then, we've seen an increase in those start to roll out. Unfortunately, I'd say they're primarily focused on the immediate aftermath of the election in terms of counting ballots and initial declarations of victory. And they're a little less kind of prescriptive on what we may expect from attempts to delegitimize an election, say during an official canvass and certification or in the electoral college process. But I do want to highlight the Election Integrity Partnership's been great about regularly updating their analysis for this and both the pre and post election phases. And they've noted that Twitter by far has the most comprehensive policies around election delegitimization, followed by Facebook. Meanwhile, YouTube, Pinterest, Nextdoor, Snapchat, and TikTok have non-comprehensive policies, and Reddit has no policy. And I think given the size and reach of YouTube, it really is concerning for us that they don't have more policies in place, and we're hoping to see more in the future. But I want to turn now to the post-election space. Kip, given your experience with elections both in the US and abroad, and with digital platforms and human and civil rights issues, you've been thinking about this a little more holistically. What are you seeing as the platforms start to focus on the post-election problem here in the US? What do you think it means for their efforts today and in the future, and how are you feeling about it?
Yeah, well, I do think there are some positive signs. We're all acutely aware of how depressing these conversations become. And look, that's because there are very legitimate risks and vulnerabilities and traumas that are undergirding this election cycle. And I don't want to diminish that, but I will try my hand at offering, some cause for maybe measured optimism or to highlight some qualified successes. And, as you alluded, Adam, at Stanford and NDI, my colleagues and I are looking at digital platforms and these policies, kind of through the lens of democracy and the human rights framework. And, a few things stand out to me as well, just different about the response to this election and kind of the evolution of looking towards post-election issues. And, one is just that for the first time, we were actually seeing policy recognition of the importance of post-election risks and democratic delegitimization as a valid concern. And, we should keep in mind that there have been countless elections around the world since 2016. Particularly through my work with NDI, I can attest that civil society have been working really hard to elevate this set of risks in other country contexts in recent years, where we've known that post-election periods present unique vulnerabilities. And while a lot of the movement at the platforms on this topic, I think have come relatively late in the election cycle here in the US, but now that these issues are a part of the policy frameworks, I think there's reason to be hopeful that this marks the beginning of efforts that can be improved upon, help inform responses to protect sort of post-election processes in other democratic contexts. Second in this cycle, I do think it's fair to say we've seen more intentional efforts, at least at certain platforms, to communicate publicly about what they're doing, what they're seeing. That includes sort of major content or network removals have been publicly announced, and they might include sort of analysis from outside researchers, major policy announcements around kind of the legitimization and some of the other risks. Are in some cases they're being rolled out with helpful explanatory context about how they might be operationalized. We definitely need to keep pushing on that kind of public communication. I mean, for one, because it's good for accountability, right? It equips users with important information about risks and rules and how they operate. And I think there are really important process rights that are attendant there. But also, somewhat secondarily, I think it's important for raising wider awareness about these risks among the public. The press report on these tech company announcements, and maybe people read about them, think about them, and if we hope to sort of prime our society in the aftermath of the election around some of these risks, we should want to see more information, more public conversation about what's happening, and we've seen some of that. We should push to see more. The final thing that I'll say that looks to have improved in this context, certainly since 2016, is just that there's evidence that there's some constructive information sharing between the platforms and federal agencies around threat assessments and attribution. And while that's necessary and I think has apparently yielded some actionable information that at least Facebook and Twitter have been able to act on regarding foreign info ops, it does, I think, also underscore some risks, in particular that we need to have a rights respecting framework in place for facilitating the exchange of information around these risks. While we're appropriately, calling on platforms to do more to address these issues to some degree, I do think that we've kind of let public policymakers off the hook. Our democracy was attacked in 2016, and we still don't have a national strategy for countering disinformation or meaningful consumer data privacy protections. So while we need to expect more from platforms on this, I think we should also expect more from public policymakers. So, not a totally optimistic take, but I think there are some directional, improvements.
And I think that is actually a really critical point. I think we tend to focus on some of the influence operations that happened in 2016, kind of pre-election, but I think and we've seen plenty of reporting recently that there's a fear that particularly with this extended counting period, there are plenty of opportunities for malicious actors, both foreign and domestic, to try and influence and kind of put themselves into that space. So it's something where we need to be aware of that potential, and so the platforms, as well to counter that. So I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind. I think we should turn a little bit here because I think it's hard to talk about one of the reasons why this post-election period might be longer is, of course, because of the global pandemic from COVID-19. And we're lucky enough to have Ifeoma here, who is an expert on platforms and how they deal with health misinformation and disinformation. She led, I think, a pretty groundbreaking effort at Pinterest around anti-vaxxer content previous to the current pandemic. And I just want to take a moment to say we've seen some pretty aggressive efforts to counter health misinformation in the last few months from platforms. Do you have a sense of what's working or not working there, and any pieces that you've seen there that you think they should be doing in the election or post-election space?
Well, I think what we've seen is pretty aggressive PR efforts. I would not go so far as to say that we've seen pretty aggressive action on health misinformation. For COVID misinformation, yes. And I think whatever is the sexiest topic at the moment, or the most pressing topic at the moment, as the pandemic is what gets a lot of attention in the way of announcements. What has been lacking is actual wholesale addressal of vaccine misinformation. And that is going to be a topic that we will talk about a lot more over the next few months, as there's already a ton of mis and disinformation on potential COVID vaccines that aren't even out on the market yet. There has been no addressal of health misinformation by the major platforms outside of COVID. And so in the same way that platforms have been able, really, and without criticism, particularly from policymakers, to pick and choose the topics that they want to address. Last week it was QAnon. There are many other dangerous conspiracy theories that are able to spread on the platforms. And there's still actually quite a lot of QAnon misinformation and content on platforms outside of Twitter and Facebook. There's a ton on Pinterest and many other places currently. What we're seeing is the lowest hanging fruit being addressed on COVID misinformation, but there are a ton of closed groups still on Facebook. There are a ton of smaller communities where people are spreading really dangerous health misinformation, and those have not been touched at all. So I'm like Kip, not as optimistic. I think policies are great. Enforcement is where policies actually matter, and we haven't seen a ton of actual enforcement yet.
That's, I think a very sobering assessment. And I think that we cannot, not that mentioning something like QAnon means we should turn solely to Melissa because she has more expertise to that. But I think, this is, I think, really a strain of thinking that we've been concerned about for a little while. And we've seen some, I think, belated steps around QAnon and other movements. But how should we understand, what's been happening and what should we be fearful for, or what more should be done here? Is it around enforcement? Is it around product or algorithm changes? Melissa, what is your sense of how we should be thinking about these developments and their context?
Sure. Well, just to put this into context about QAnon, the pandemic has been a boon for QAnon in exposure online. We know that during the pandemic, there were so many anti-COVID conspiracies, and folks flocked to those online, and it eventually led them to QAnon. I actually did some research, participated in some research with Friends of the Earth, where we've been tracking climate denial conversation for several months. And our climate deniers during the pandemic stopped talking about climate denial entirely for a while. And they started talking first about anti-COVID conspiracies, and then, of course, they moved into QAnon. And now you have a situation, both with our climate deniers, but also broadly, where internet influencers, both right-wing and more mainstream, are using QAnon as a bid to stay relevant. So they'll start mixing what I'd call Q-curious content and QAnon signaling into their posts. QAnon is building a significant amount of political power. There are over 80 candidates running for Congress this cycle who are believers in QAnon. We will have at least one QAnon believer in Congress. Also, QAnon is a violent movement. We have seen QAnon believers be involved in terrorism around locking the Hoover Dam, the murder of a mob boss. I wish I was kidding. A couple of kidnappings, at least one arson. The platforms have finally taken action on QAnon, but it has been too little too late. And what we see is this movement is so large, they're able to adapt quickly. So the first Twitter and Facebook QAnon takedown, they immediately pivoted to using Save the Children and co-opting human trafficking messages, which allowed them not only to keep operating online, but also allowed them to bring in new audiences who maybe had no idea what QAnon was, but suddenly found themselves at an offline rally that was ostensibly about anti-trafficking. By the way, this has also created just a horrible situation for legitimate anti-trafficking groups who now, on top of the work that they do, have to debunk disinformation about QAnon, and in some cases deal with online harassment from QAnon believers. When you think about this group, the political power they're building, their potential for violence, and the way they've grown under the pandemic, being thrown into the mix of the post-election period, given their feelings about government and the belief that it's all a giant conspiracy, I'm really concerned about the potential for violence from QAnon, and QAnon being used to stoke it in particular.
So one of the things we talk a lot about, and I think a lot of people who pay attention to the digital rights space or the platform accountability space focus on, is rules. And I know these are rules that some of us have helped write or have monitored very closely, but I think that lets the other aspect of social media platforms off the hook, which is the products and the algorithms. These are interfaces that are designed to speed up the flow of information. They're interfaces designed to, or algorithms designed to spread and propagate it as widely as possible, as quickly as possible. And I think it's becoming clear that that might not be an orientation that is fully positive in a charged environment like the post-election period. And so, we saw some announcements last week from Twitter where they're making actual product changes to their design. So they are no longer allowing you to retweet without comment. They're forcing you to put up a screen where you might have to put some thought into it. So, which I think upset a certain kind of group of folks, because the idea that a retweet might have to be an endorsement is something that, is apparently the greatest threat to our speech and democracy. We saw them actually just decide that there were some features they had turned on for growth, like tweets that showed up in your timeline that from people you like, you follow, or maybe don't follow, but others you follow do, just turning them off because they think they can't be controlled in this context. And I think that's actually something that, as we wrote our report that we mirrored in our previous report on COVID misinfo, needs to be a greater focus. So we suggested something like a viral circuit breaker, mirroring what the stock markets have when activity drops too much dramatically to stop trading. Ellen Goodman had proposed this kind of originally, and we built out some of the concept to say, as things are going viral too quickly, they deserve a check to make sure that they're not kind of disproportionately spreading. We have others as well in our report, but I want to ask maybe each of you, are there a product or a algorithmic recommendation, tweak, change should be turned off that you think that for the election or the post-election period you would recommend platforms do? Is there anything that jumps to mind? Maybe starting with Kip and then just going around the Robert, or anyone who has an idea.
I'll start, and credit to Free Press for this idea, actually. But I think Facebook and events, I don't think you should be shutting down events entirely. But I think there needs to be, if an event has a clear call to violence, or if it is an actor or a group that is known to be violent or have violent activity, they should not be allowed to post events without review.
I think that's a great recommendation, and that mirrors one of our recommendations around greater accounting for calls to violence off a site, maybe impacting somebody's ability to post freely on a site. Anyone else?
Yeah, well, I would maybe pick up a little bit on what Ifeoma was saying about enforcement. And, it's important that the platforms are enforcing the rules that they have, one. It's also important that they enforce them equally. And so I think that, the tension is, there are a lot of free expression and sort of public access to information rights that are implicated by some of these interventions, when, especially when you're talking about public officials and their declarations. But that said, I think that exempting them from enforcement entirely is, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think that there are other ways to sort of balance that interest in accessing that information, whether it's curating moderated content by public officials and making it accessible somewhere else on the platform for review and for sort of posterity's sake. To the extent that labels, that it's important to sort of contextualize with additional information. Thinking about the friction and the actual interface of that label is really important too, and can be a way to sort of preserve those free expression and access to information interests, but while really, perhaps in a more efficacious way, priming the user to understand that something about this is problematic.
The suggestion I have is less about what they should do and more about what they could be doing, which is sharing more data with researchers. One of the things that I did when I was at Pinterest before we even embarked on addressing health mis and disinformation at the platform level was take a survey of what actually was on the platform. So what types we had assumptions about what types of misinformation existed on the platform. As it pertained to health, what we actually saw was that breast cancer was a major topic for health misinformation. The HPV vaccine was one. Those make sense because of the demographics of the users on the platform, mostly women. So what do the platforms know about the kinds of political dis and misinformation that exists on the platform? And then why are they not willing to share it with researchers? Because then I think together there could be a community response to coming up with the interventions that actually work. I'm not sure that labeling works. Maybe it does. We don't have enough data to prove that. I'm not sure that limiting distribution works because we don't actually know the reach of most types of content that are shared. If it's on Facebook or on a Facebook group, we have no idea about reach. Twitter is a little bit more transparent just because of the way the platform works. But I think there need to be more demands for the actual data that is necessary to then come up with useful interventions. And we don't have that currently.
I think that's a really important part on the data. And I know the Annenberg Transatlantic group proposed a really interesting piece around 3-tier disclosure systems that I encourage people to take a look at. But I also think it's important, the Kevin Roos of the New York Times has been posting the top 10 links that have been going, to get the most traffic on any engagement on Facebook using CrowdTangle data. And Facebook has claimed that that's misrepresentative because conservatives tend to be somewhere between 8 and the top 10 or 9 of the top 10 spots. And they claim that's misrepresentative data that's not showing the full picture. But CrowdTangle is a tool that Facebook provides to entities to do research on Facebook, particularly those, they give it away to those in the civil rights or other community who are trying to ferret out violent actors and voter suppression. So I think it's concerning that their defense is the tool we provide isn't, kind of fully there. I do want to circle back to both what Kip and others have said, which is, labels get thrown around a lot as a solution, as they're applied or not. And there is this question of one, not all labels are created equal. I think there's some very legitimate concern that some of the generic labels that Facebook applies to all posts might legitimize, things about voting. But in your mind, how do you feel about labels? What do you think is the most effective? What would you like to see more of? Or do you think labels just are kind of a red herring that maybe, distracts us from other more important things that could be done? Because I think this is the thing that keeps being elevated over and over again. For anyone.
Well, I think the best research I've seen on this is from Avaz with their Correct the Record information. And they have some specific recommendations both for labeling and for letting users know when they've been exposed to disinformation, which Facebook has taken none of. But I really want to lift up Ifeoma's point again, that we just don't have enough research on it. So I may feel some kind of way about labels, but I would really like more data to back that up.
Perfect. I just want to remind everybody who's watching along that you can submit questions using the tab at the bottom of your screen. You can also tweet them using the hashtag after the polls close as well. And I think actually I'm going to go to a question that somebody submitted that touches on a point that Kip made earlier around some of the rules. I think some of us have made the rules that platforms use. But the question is, what about the argument that platforms make that they don't want to publish the rules because bad actors could then game the rules? And I think this is both an excuse, but also something that is really, let's start with you, Kip. What is the benefit and argument for this increased transparency from a rights respecting perspective? And how do you think about that kind of argument?
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's more important to think about rules and processes from the perspective of the rights of users rather than the potential sort of behavior of bad actors. Just at least at a foundational level, you need to understand and sort of anticipate the risks, and you want your policies to be calibrated to mitigate those specific harms. But users do have rights, I believe, in the information space. And it isn't that, these companies that they have legal obligations under, international human rights law in the same way that state actors do. But they are stewards of essentially, the public information sphere. And so they have responsibilities that are analogous, and information about these rules and about how they operate are really important from the perspective of sort of both accountability for how they are enforcing them and the extent to which they are living up to their commitments and that they are actually protecting users. But more importantly, from the perspective of the user's rights, these are sort of process rights. They have a right, we as users have a right to understand what risks, what the risks are that we're accepting by navigating these platforms and by consuming information on them, and what rules are in place to protect us. And it's I think from that perspective, it's really important that users are able to accurately consent to what it is they're what risks and what sort of experience they're going to have online.
I mean, I have never seen a situation where being transparent about policies then prevents enforcement. That's an excuse in my mind, and it's a lame excuse because there's absolutely there's nothing that keeps folks from enforcing the policies if that is what they truly want to do. If you never plan on enforcing them anyway, then yeah, sure, I guess you could use being transparent as a reason for why your job is harder. But I don't see it and didn't see it in the context that I worked in.
Perfect. Well, thank you. One of the things that I mentioned at the top of the presentation, we've seen increased reporting about the potential for potential foreign interference, not just before the election, but also after, different kind of potential scenarios around information that might be put out there, hack and leak operations and other things. Melissa, we've talked a little bit about this, but how do you think about the context of foreign versus domestic disinformation campaigns or potential in a post-election period? And does it really matter where the source is if the impact and outcome kind of content out there is matter? How do you think about that, and how would you encourage others to think about it?
Well, I remain a lot more concerned about domestic disinformation than foreign interference at this point. I think there's no argument that foreign interference isn't ongoing. Obviously, with the news we saw this week about Iran and Russia, we know places like Stanford have been studying it extensively, but we also have disinformers with the power of, they have a lot of levers and a lot of authority. I'm trying to think of the best way to say this, to disseminate disinformation from official channels. I would also say that in terms of disinformation, any foreign interference, they are working with material that our own cultural and political weaknesses have given them. So Russia and Iran, they don't create racial tension. They don't create a culture war. They are simply exploiting issues that America has refused to deal with politically and culturally. The one thing that I will say, and I think this is true of both domestic and foreign interference, but we don't talk about enough, and it surprises me, considering that I think the most effective thing that Russia may have done in 2016 were the email leaks of the DNC. And, this is certainly something that folks at CAP know a lot about. And we've seen that, it looks like this Hunter Biden laptop situation may be similar, maybe what First Draft would call it malinformation, which is information released specifically to cause harm. And so for all the brouhaha about disinformation, which I think is valid, we really need to focus more, not just on leaked and hacked materials, but how the press is covering them and how political campaigns may or may not exploit them.
And Kip, I know that you've seen and been tracking a lot of what's been happening globally with foreign interference in other countries. Are the trends we're seeing or worried about, things that have been piloted elsewhere and brought here? Are we seeing original threats, or we have a very American-centric view in this country when it comes to our elections of exceptionalism, which may or may not be merited. But given your broader global perspective, how do you think about the threat matrix today?
Well, first of all, just to piggyback on what Melissa was just saying, I think the hack and leak operations policies is a really good example of where transparency could play a really useful role. I think we saw a major breakdown and blowback on the platforms because their policies were not well understood, and they hadn't really communicated, how those policies would be operationalized. And, there was very poor execution and then communication around those policies. And I think it really exacerbated, part of the challenge on addressing that particular content. But, moving to your question, I definitely, in thinking about sort of the threat landscape, but then also, the relative sort of actors and stakeholders in developing constructive solutions, I think there's definitely room, for some other stakeholders to be elevated in this space and in these conversations. Civil society has a bigger role to play, and I will plus one to what Ifeoma was saying about the information differential. I mean, it's so enormous. Right now, really, the platforms are kind of in the position of grading their own homework, which I don't think is in their long-term interests. And So there's a bigger role for civil society here. I want to call out Brandy Nonaki at the Public Interest Rights Alliance at UC Berkeley, who's really working to create a permission structure for privacy protecting ways to collaborate on data sets for public interest purposes with the platforms that could create opportunities for, I think, more meaningful collaboration and oversight. We also need to think about traditional media and how to prepare journalists and newsrooms to navigate these issues responsibly. And as a starting place there, two of my colleagues at Stanford, Andy Grotto and Janine Zakaria, developed a blueprint for reporting on hacks and disinformation earlier this year. It has guidance for newsrooms. I think it's a good starting place. I recommend it. And then finally, I do think we need to look at some of the more foundational challenges and vulnerabilities in our democracy right now that I mentioned at the start of the program. And on that score, Danielle Allen at Harvard, she co-led a national task force that just published a report with recommendations over the summer. It's called Our Common Purpose. It's essentially outlining strategies for reinvigorating American democracy and building a more resilient society. And it's ambitious, but I do think that the report itself provides a really comprehensive overview of sort of what these challenges look like. And we need that kind of thinking to help inoculate our society against these digital threats, whether they're foreign or domestic.
I think that's a series of points that really make sense. And I think when we look at two of those things, one of which is the kind of response to the hacked materials, which again, I think we at CAP feel very strongly about and kind of understand, particularly in a time frame so close to the election, things that mirror, for instance, what happened in France with the Macron leaks, that it is important to take action. I think, the policy is a little less, and how it nets out, and Melissa, maybe you can speak to this, is a little less worrying than the idea that these rules that are going to kind of be in place in theory to enforce an election can be dramatically changed maybe 2 or 3 weeks before because of outcry. And so, how does that make you feel about the other rules that we are hoping will be enforced, Melissa? And kind of what's your takeaway from that?
Yeah, it's maddening. Around the New York Post story and again, the Hunter Biden laptop, Twitter, which had hacked materials policy in place since 2019. It was publicly available. It got pressed. We all knew about it, those of us who study policy. Because of outcry, they changed it twice in 24 hours, which for a user is very frustrating. Because if any policy this close out is subject to be changed for political reasons, what trust can we have in any of the policies? It's particularly disappointing from Twitter because, as others have noted, none of the tech platforms have done enough. But I think Twitter had taken the most concrete steps really in the past 6 months thinking about the election.
And I think sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, so I agree with you completely, Melissa. And also there's so much pressure, unfortunately, and external pressure that goes into the policymaking process at these platforms that I don't think that folks are as aware of. And if there's a way to take some of that or separate some of that, and we've seen Twitter do a better job at that than Facebook, certainly, that would make things easier. But part of the issue is the lack of transparency. If Twitter were able to explain to us, okay, exactly how did you come to this decision? Why did you change your policy at this time? Then I think there would be more of an understanding of what happened and why it happened and why they thought it was in the best interest of Twitter users. They've done a much better job in the last 6 months than any other platform in explaining their policy changes, how they'll affect users, and how they're thinking about enforcement. No other platform basically has, and so they're going to get a bit more criticism because of the transparency that they have provided than others who are providing that. And YouTube is a great example of that. We almost don't talk about the lack of policy changes from YouTube because there are none to talk about.
I want to maybe ask one more question before we go to a kind of a final wrap-up question for everyone. But, Kip, I think you alluded to this earlier that, correctly, because I think, unfortunately, either because of a lack of willingness or the split in government or other pieces, we're really stuck instead of regulating right now or imposing, government action or having any sort of pressure there. There's no functioning FEC, if memory serves, among other things, making demands of platforms. But, I think it is, I think particularly when it comes to foreign interference, maybe not fully fair that platforms have to shoulder the full burden of countering, global disinformation from state actors and other things. In the short term and in the long term, what more should we be asking of our governments, or this government or a new government in this country in order to face these challenges, not in 2020 necessarily, but beyond?
Is that for me, Adam?
Yeah. Oh yeah, sorry.
Sure. No, I think that there are a lot of steps that governments need to be thinking about. We're seeing a lot of really irresponsible sort of politicization of around platform accountability discussions from policymakers, and part of it I feel like is scapegoating a little bit, and part of it is just it's just political posturing around issues of bias, or we don't like this, we don't like that. There is not a sort of cohesive sort of rights-based or values-based framework around which any of these policy considerations are happening. And so it's really important that one, our policymakers need to get smarter on what these issues are, how they impact rights and freedoms, and really level up on sort of the what the effective solutions might look like, and how we can create sort of privacy respecting mechanisms for accountability, oversight, maybe auditability, those types of issues. I do think that transparency is a really good starting place around platforms of a certain scale, and we've seen some proposals along those lines that I think are imperfect, but are at least the beginning of that conversation. I also think the Annenberg report that you mentioned earlier, Adam, includes some useful recommendations that are respectful of free expression sensitivities, but also would help to promote greater accountability. But one thing that I will say is that we've got to get smarter about connecting domestic tech policy discussions with sort of global internet freedom and our sort of global and sort of diplomatic foreign policy objectives, and advancing a rights-based free and open internet. Because these are global platforms, these are global issues. We can't do this alone, and we can't be making policy decisions about, for example, banning TikTok that are totally at odds, with our vision for a free and open internet. And so we have to have a more nuanced framework for evaluating legitimate national security risks and how we might address those. Vis-a-vis sort of some of the, and kind of balancing them against some of these other interests. And we're just not seeing that level of sophistication in the space.
Great. Well, I want to end with a kind of question for all of you that came from the audience, and I'll add my own spin to it, which is, as you may be aware, next Wednesday, the Senate Commerce Committee will be having the CEOs of Facebook, Google, and Twitter to talk about ostensibly Section 230, though, given that that is a Senate hearing in very close proximity to an election, there's a strong likelihood that it might not be solely about that particular policy matter. And so, and that comes as the subject, or sorry, that hearing comes about after subpoenas were issued for the CEOs. Subpoenas were recently issued by the Judiciary Committee, and there was almost a hearing. It sounds like it might not happen before the election now, but there's obviously a lot of political pressure there. So I think for each of you, and then I'll close it up, I have two questions. One, what do you think the kind of impact of this kind of hearing has on the companies? And more importantly, and the real meat of the question, I think, is, if you could give them one focus or one ask a CEO or all of the CEOs to give one focus or recommendation in the post-election period to make sure things don't go bad, what would that be? Let's start with Melissa.
Well, I think in terms of hearings, tech executives and tech CEOs have been called before Congress a lot in the past couple of years, and it hasn't led to much in the way of large-scale policy changes. I think the most they've gotten is a few days of bad PR. So my hope is, next year, as we continue to bring tech executives before Congress, which I always think is a good idea, that it's paired with the threat of actual legislation and regulation, and not just used to score political points or great YouTube moments. I think that's the most important thing. In terms of what I would suggest to the tech platforms, you have to treat this as a systemic issue with the potential for violence and blood on your hands, and not just as a PR problem. And I think we're in a better place than we were 6 months ago. But I still feel like most of the time, when a new policy or something new rolls out from the tech companies, that they're still thinking about the public relations aspect before they're thinking about the human aspect of protecting their users from hate, harassment, and harm online.
Great, thank you. Anyone else?
I'd agree with Melissa completely. I'd also say, hearings are an exercise in repeating what comms and legal have approved. So I don't expect them to be something that's educational for any of us. What I would push on, and I would hope that policymakers or at least their staff have written for them to push on, is the hypocrisy in the stance on protecting freedom of expression and preventing the chilling effect that many CEOs take in their defense of 230. 230 has issues, 230 it has benefits. I don't believe in removing it wholesale, but the positions of the CEOs and the companies, I think, is fundamentally hypocritical, especially when we look at the ways, like Kip has mentioned, that they are not defending freedom of expression outside of the US or even inside of the US for certain groups. For the post-election period, I'm going to go back, and I'm repeating myself here, but to transparency. I don't think that we can afford to be in a position like the one we were in 2016, where up till now, there are certain things we don't know about distribution and about who was targeted and about what they were targeted with. I think it would behoove the platforms to figure that out as soon as they can after the election and to share that publicly, whether it makes them look bad or not, because that's the only way we prevent conversations like this in 2024 or in 2024, talking about what we missed from 2020 that we also missed in 2016.
Yeah, ditto to everything my co-panelists have just said, and I really don't have too much to add with respect to the value of the hearings. I think that's essentially been covered, but I do think that in terms of a concrete ask with respect to the post-election environment is, we really do need all the platforms, and Twitter and Facebook have been more concrete about this, but we need all of the platforms to be very clear, like today, and well in advance of what exactly they're going to do with falsifiable candidate declarations of victory before the results are credibly determined, how exactly they're going to be sort of evaluating those claims, what is the validator that they're going to use to determine whether the election is called. Those are just really important steps that not all of the platforms have taken, and that is not to their benefit. They don't want to be making those decisions in the dark. There is no good outcome for them for acting just in the moment or without transparently communicating what those steps are going to look like. So that's just something that I would absolutely prioritize.
And as I think Kip, as well, you're well aware as an election lawyer, these are simple issues. And so you have to think about them ahead of time and get the expertise to plan for them, or it is nearly impossible to make that determination in the moment. Well, I want to close by just saying that if I were given that opportunity to tell them, ask them to focus on, it would really be about planning ahead and starting to implement product and algorithmic changes today, because by the point that it may becomes overwhelmed with potential disinformation or violence and it's too late to go out and try and build something there. It's something that's really important to build today, to have on hand and to set out transparently when it will be used from both a product point of view. And as you said, when the rules are enforced, and I'd say not just in the premature declaration of victory or a contentious period, but what do you do in a deep period of delegitimization, even if there's a clear winner? And I think that's a very difficult position that most people haven't thought about, which is if the electoral context is in question, will you allow a platform to solely be used for a way to really erode the foundations of our democracy, even if the results aren't in question? And I think that's a tremendous challenge that we hope that they will take into account, because I think they will really be held accountable for it going forward. So I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. We know that it's a Friday before the election, and we really appreciate it. And we'll hope you'll take a chance to take a look at our new report and to join any future events. And we hope that you also remember to make sure to make a plan to vote and to do so safely. Thank you, everyone.